Officer Michael Anderson had spent more than 2 decades on the force, and the years had hardened him. At 50, his reputation was cemented in the airport precincts. His sharp eyes missed little, and his demeanor was often unapproachable, a product of years spent navigating the tough and unpredictable nature of airport security. As a veteran, he had seen it all, or so he thought. But the world had shifted around him, and his views had not kept pace. A man of few words, Anderson was quick to judge, especially when it came to people who didn't fit his narrow understanding of what was normal. His prejudices were deeply rooted, a reflection of the struggles he'd faced in his career and the world outside of it. He would look at a person and, without much thought, categorize them based on the color of their skin, the way they spoke, or the passport they carried. Today, the target of his scrutiny was a black man who stood confidently in the line, holding a West African passport. Anderson watched the man approach, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. There was something about his stride, the way he carried himself, too sure, too confident, as if he didn't belong in this space. In that moment, Anderson's mind began its familiar dance of assumptions. This man, with his strong posture and the foreign passport, was someone to be watched, though someone who didn't fit the mold. "Where are you headed?" Officer Anderson's voice was gruff as he addressed the man. The black man, wearing an expression that suggested he'd been through this kind of thing before, paused only momentarily before responding. "I'm just catching a flight. No problem." But Anderson's instincts were telling him something different. His years of experience had taught him to trust those instincts, and in this case, they were leading him straight into a place of prejudice and suspicion. Anderson didn't see the man's confidence as a sign of self-assuredness or success. Instead, he saw it as something to be questioned, something to challenge. The interaction continued, each word adding weight to the officer's biased narrative. But beneath the surface of this routine exchange lay a deeper conversation, one about the judgments we make based on appearances and the stories we tell ourselves about others. Anderson's behavior was a reflection of a broader societal issue, the assumptions we make about people based on race, nationality, or simply the way they present themselves. But as the exchange continued, something shifted. The black man remained calm, not reacting to Anderson's underlying hostility, enough showing a level of patience and dignity that seemed to momentarily throw the officer off guard. It was in this quiet resistance, this refusal to engage with the expected conflict, that the real question lay. What if we stopped making assumptions about people before we got to know them? What if we approached each individual as a person first, not as a stereotype or a symbol of something we don't understand? As you watch this video, take a moment to reflect. How often do we let our first impressions shape our interactions? And how can we break the cycle of judgment to build more meaningful connections? The tension in the air was palpable as Officer Michael Anderson stood in front of Samuel Kofi, a calm yet unwavering presence. As Anderson gripped the West African passport in his hands, something in him snapped. The small foreign passport, something he had dismissed as unimportant, became the symbol of his prejudice, the trigger for a rash decision. With a deliberate motion, Anderson held the passport over a nearby open flame. The edges of the paper started to curl, the colors of the printing beginning to smudge as he mockingly stared at Kofi. The crowd around them began to murmur, unsure of what was happening. Some of them watched in silence, others with growing discomfort, but no one intervened. The officer's power in this space was unquestionable, and the man with the West African passport was a foreigner in more ways than one. "Guess you don't need this anymore," Anderson sneered, the fire's light reflecting off his hardened face. He held the passport up to the man's eyes, laughing as it continued to burn. For a brief moment, Samuel Kofi didn't react. He didn't flinch or raise his voice in anger, though his gaze remained unwavering, sharp. His hands were still, as if to remind everyone that he was in control of his response, despite the blatant provocation. His voice, calm and steady, cut through the tension like a blade. "You'll regret this," he warned softly, the words laced with an unspoken depth. His warning wasn't a threat born of fury. It was the quiet assurance of someone who understood the cost of prejudice far better than the officer before him. Anderson didn't take the warning seriously. He dismissed it with a dismissive chuckle, the laugh of a man who thought he had all the answers, the upper hand, and the power to act without consequence. But as Kofi stood there, poised in the face of disrespect, a strange unease began to creep into Anderson's mind. For the first time, the officer was questioning his actions, not because he feared the consequences, but because there was something in the man's calmness that unsettled him. The onlookers, now fully aware of the injustice unfolding before them, were torn. Some felt helpless, others uncomfortable, and a few even began to record the incident on their phones. But no one stepped forward to stop Anderson, for the scene was too complicated, too layered with social dynamics that made it hard to intervene. Kofi's warning echoed in the air, hanging there like a promise, as the officer's smirk faded. Was it a moment of clarity or just a fleeting discomfort in his gut? Michael Anderson could not tell. But as Kofi stood there, his composure stronger than ever, there was a deeper question that everyone, whether they realized it or not, was beginning to grapple with. How much power do we really have over others when we use it to demean, to degrade, or to disrespect? And at what point does that power come back to us, not as a consequence, but as a lesson we are forced to learn? For the viewers watching this video, I'd like to ask, what do you think the real cost of prejudice is, both for the person who holds it and for the one it is aimed at? How do we learn to recognize the humanity in others before it's too late? The events of that day had left Michael Anderson with a lingering discomfort, but he had quickly pushed it aside, half chalking it up to the stress of the job. He'd acted rashly, and he had gotten away with it. In his mind, that was the end of the story, or at least it was supposed to be. The following Monday, Anderson arrived at the precinct as usual, his routine unshaken, but there was an undeniable buzz in the air. Officers were gathered in small groups, whispering in hushed tones. Something was happening, and Anderson could sense it, but he didn't quite know what. As he made his way through the station, his eyes narrowed in confusion. The briefing room was packed. Officers, detectives, and support staff all stood shoulder to shoulder, some with coffee cups in hand, others with notepads. The chatter in the room gradually died down as the door at the front swung open. "Good morning, everyone," a deep voice rang out. Michael's eyes widened in surprise as he recognized the man who walked into the room. It was Samuel Kofi, the same man he had mocked, the one whose passport he had burned, the man who had warned him that he'd regret it. And now here he was, standing at the front of the room, exuding an air of calm confidence that made the entire room fall silent. Kofi's presence was commanding. His poise, his self-assurance, it all radiated from him. For a moment, Michael felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting. He could feel his heart rate spike as Kofi looked around the room, his eyes scanning each officer before they finally landed on Michael, locking in on him with an intensity that was almost palpable. "As most of you know," Kofi began, his voice steady and clear, "I'm Samuel Kofi, and I've recently been appointed as your new chief of police. It's an honor to be here with all of you today." The room was still. Michael's hands trembled, his grip tightening around the folder in his hand. He could feel the sweat on his brow, his breath catching in his throat. This couldn't be real. This man, the one he had humiliated, was now his superior. The realization hit him like a wave. Kofi continued, his words directed at the entire station, but Michael couldn't focus on anything else but the fact that the man he had so casually degraded was now in charge of him. He was the one who held the power now, and the shame of what had happened in the airport suddenly weighed on Michael's chest like a stone. I expect nothing but the highest level of professionalism from each of you, Kofi went on, his gaze unwavering. We have a lot of work to do, and it's crucial that we move forward as a team, respecting one another, no exceptions. The room was silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't just the awe of his new position, it was the quiet understanding that Kofi had already won. Not just the role, but the respect of everyone present, even if they hadn't yet realized it. Michael's mind raced, replaying the events of the previous week. The mocking laughter, the burning of the passport, Kofi's calm warning, and now this. He had underestimated the man, assuming his confidence was a flaw, his passport a weakness. But the truth was, Kofi had always been far more than what Michael had seen. Kofi's eyes shifted back to Michael for a brief moment, and in that look, Michael could see it. The quiet acknowledgement that his actions had consequences and that those consequences were far from over. It wasn't revenge Kofi sought. It was a lesson. As the room began to settle into Kofi's leadership, Michael stood frozen in place, trying to process everything that had just transpired. The shock, the humiliation, it was all too much. But deep down, he knew this was a moment that would change him forever. As you watch this unfold, consider this. How often do we judge others based on our assumptions, only to find out that our judgments have been misplaced? How can we grow from the moments when we realize we've wronged someone? And how does true leadership reveal itself in times of challenge? That evening, after the chaotic and shocking events of the day, Officer Michael Anderson walked through the door of his home, the weight of the morning still heavy on his shoulders. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to hold an unspoken tension. He dropped his keys on the kitchen counter, running a hand through his hair, still feeling a little disoriented by the morning's revelations. "Hey, Michael, how was your day?" His wife, Linda, called from the living room, her voice laced with the weariness of a long day herself. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes glued to the television, but she turned to face him when she saw his expression. Michael let out a deep breath, then smirked as he walked into the room. "It was interesting, to say the least. You wouldn't believe what happened today at the precinct. Remember that guy I had a run-in with at the airport, Samuel Kofi? He's my new boss now. Can you believe that?" Linda raised an eyebrow, her voice skeptical. "Wait, the one you treated so badly?" Michael shrugged, clearly unfazed. "I'm just saying I didn't expect him to be the chief of police. But hey, things work out, right? I've been at this job for years. He's just some guy with a passport. Nothing to worry about." His daughter, Emily, who had been sitting at the kitchen table, stood up sharply, her chair scraping against the floor. The moment Michael mentioned Kofi's position, her face darkened, and she could no longer hold her tongue. "Dad, I can't believe you. You treated that man with so much disrespect, just because of where he's from. And now you're boasting about it?" Emily's voice trembled with anger and disbelief. "How could you think that was okay?" Michael's smirk faltered as his daughter's words hit him like a slap. He took a step back, defensive. "Emily, you don't understand. I did what I had to do. You don't get it. You don't know what it's like to be in that position, to be the one who has to make tough calls." But Emily wasn't backing down. Her eyes flashed with frustration as she stepped closer to him. "Tough calls? You think it was tough to treat him like that? You think it was tough to humiliate him?" "No, Dad, that was just pure racism. You abused your power, and it was wrong." Michael's heart rate quickened as the tension in the room built. He glanced at Linda, expecting her support, but instead she was sitting there, her face shadowed by disappointment. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, then dropped to the floor. "I didn't raise you to be like this, Michael," she said softly, her voice pained. "What happened to the man I married? The one who stood for fairness and justice? I can't believe you're acting like this over a little authority. It's not about power, It's about respect. Michael felt his world start to unravel. His daughter's words stung, but it was Linda's disappointment that cut the deepest. He had spent years believing he was in control, that his way of thinking was justified, even superior. But now, in the face of his family's condemnation, he was starting to question everything. He opened his mouth to say something, anything to defend his actions, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood there, silent, staring at the two people he loved most in the world, both of whom now looked at him as though they didn't recognize him. Emily shook her head, her voice quieter now, but still filled with conviction. "You have to do better, Dad. We're better than this." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument he had ever had. In the past, he had always won these battles, using his experience, his power, and his authority to silence the opposition. But now, facing his own family's disgust, he realized that this time he had lost something far more important: their respect. Linda stood up, walking toward him slowly, her gaze still not meeting his. She spoke without bitterness, but with a sadness that weighed on every word. "I don't know where you went wrong, Michael, but if you don't change, I don't know if I can be proud of you anymore." Michael felt his chest tighten as the realization began to sink in. This wasn't just about one incident, one wrong decision at work. This was about the kind of man he had become. And as he stood there, his daughter's words echoing in his mind, he had to face the truth. He had become someone he didn't even recognize. As you watch this scene unfold, I want to ask you, how do we reconcile our actions when we've hurt the people we love? And what does it take to truly change when we realize that we've lost the respect of those who matter most? The morning after the shocking revelation at the precinct, the air felt charged with anticipation. Officers who had once viewed Michael Anderson as a figure of authority were now adjusting to a new reality. Samuel Kofi was their chief of police. But beyond the mere change in leadership, it was clear that Kofi was not just interested in holding a position of power. He was determined to make meaningful changes. Kofi wasted no time in outlining his vision for the department. In his first official meeting as chief, he stood before the officers with an air of quiet confidence that commanded respect. But it wasn't just his presence that caught their attention. It was his words, the clarity with which he spoke about the future. "I've come here not to maintain the status quo," Kofi began, his voice steady and direct. "I've come here to build a department that serves everyone fairly, that holds itself accountable, and that respects the rights of every individual inside and outside these walls. The people we serve deserve better, and so do you, the officers who dedicate themselves to this job every day." The room was silent, each officer digesting his words. There was an underlying tension, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. They had been led by officers like Anderson before, men who ruled through fear, power, and unspoken biases. But Samuel Kofi was different. He spoke with an authenticity that couldn't be ignored. "Transparency," Kofi continued, "is the foundation of trust. If we want to change, we need to start by being honest with ourselves. We need to hold each other accountable, not just when it's easy, but when it's uncomfortable." To implement this vision, Kofi immediately introduced a series of reforms aimed at transforming the culture within the department. The first of these reforms was the implementation of an anonymous reporting system. Officers who witnessed misconduct or unethical behavior, whether from colleagues or superiors, could now report their concerns without fear of retaliation. This was a monumental shift, considering how the culture of silence had previously prevailed. The system was designed to ensure that every officer, no matter their rank, could speak out without jeopardizing their career. "We cannot build trust if we are afraid to expose wrongdoing," Kofi explained. "Our department will not tolerate abuse of power, discrimination, or any form of bias. If you see something, you must say something, and you will do so safely and confidentially." In addition to the reporting system, Kofi introduced regular internal audits to ensure that the department's practices were in line with its newly established values of fairness and accountability. These audits would assess everything from use of force policies to hiring practices, and their results would be publicly shared. No area would be exempt from scrutiny. Kofi knew that for these reforms to succeed, they had to be more than just policy. They had to become the culture. To this end, he rolled out mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, including those who had been with the department for decades. The training focused not only on racial bias, but also on unconscious bias, ensuring that officers examined their own preconceived notions and learned how to respond to situations with fairness and empathy. As the first week of reforms went by, there were mixed reactions. Some officers embraced the changes, feeling a sense of relief at the prospect of working in a more transparent and accountable environment. Others resisted, struggling with the idea that their actions would be scrutinized more closely. But the tension began to fade as Kofi's leadership style became clearer. It wasn't about punishment, it was about education, growth, and fairness. Over time, the anonymous reporting system proved effective. Complaints that would have been ignored or buried under the old regime began to surface, and the department responded swiftly to address issues of misconduct. Officers who once felt powerless began to believe that change was possible, that their voices could make a difference. Perhaps the most profound shift came when Kofi gathered the entire department for a reflection session. Change doesn't happen overnight, he told them, but every day you can choose to be better. You can choose to treat others with dignity, to check your own biases, and to hold yourselves accountable. The question isn't whether we'll face challenges, it's how we'll meet them. For Michael Anderson, witnessing these changes from the sidelines was a bitter pill to swallow. He had been a part of the old system, one that allowed power to go unchecked, and where prejudice had been allowed to fester. Watching Kofi lead with such integrity made him confront the person he had become and the actions he had taken. It was a reckoning he hadn't expected, but one he knew was necessary if he ever hoped to rebuild his career and, perhaps more importantly, his sense of self. As you reflect on these changes, I want to ask, how can we foster a culture of transparency and accountability in environments where power has often gone unchecked? And what role does personal growth play in the journey toward creating a more just and equitable society? Despite the changes that were unfolding in the department, Michael Anderson couldn't bring himself to accept them. The reforms Samuel Kofi had introduced, transparency, fairness, and accountability, were a slap in the face to everything Michael had come to know and believe. His worldview had been built on the idea that power should be exercised without question, that those who held authority should not have to answer to anyone, and certainly not to the very people they served. For days, Michael wrestled with his frustration. He watched as Kofi's leadership slowly began to win over some of the officers. They were starting to adapt to the new protocols, to the idea that their actions were being watched not just by the public, but by their fellow officers. Michael felt increasingly isolated, like a relic of the past. As the pressure mounted, Michael decided that something had to be done. He wasn't going to let Kofi, a man he saw as weak, a man who had stood there quietly as his authority was mocked, take everything from him. The power, the respect, the control, it had been his for so long. He wasn't about to let some new chief change all of that. Michael started to conspire with a few of his colleagues who shared his resentment toward Kofi. They began working in secret, planning ways to undermine the chief's authority and tarnish his reputation. They knew the new system Kofi had implemented would make it harder to get away with misconduct, but they were clever. They planted fabricated evidence, hoping to paint Kofi as a corrupt leader. someone who wasn't as principled as he claimed to be. The plot was subtle at first: small discrepancies, manipulated reports, and fabricated complaints. They knew that if they could get even a hint of wrongdoing to stick, they could start a chain reaction that would force Kofi to step down. They even planted false anonymous reports that would appear to implicate Kofi in misconduct, hoping that their carefully crafted lies would trigger an investigation. At first, it seemed like their scheme was working. Kofi was made aware of the reports, the whispers of misconduct spreading throughout the department like wildfire. The tension grew, and Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on: Kofi's unwavering dedication to the principles of transparency and truth. Samuel Kofi was not the type of man to act impulsively. He wasn't one to let gossip or false reports steer him away from the truth. He knew something wasn't right, and he decided to investigate the allegations thoroughly. With the same calm precision he had applied to every other aspect of his leadership, Kofi began to look deeper into the sources of the fabricated evidence. It didn't take long before he began to connect the dots. The anonymous reports, the inconsistencies in the internal audits, the small errors in the reports, everything started to point back to one place: Michael Anderson. Kofi wasn't fooled by the smokescreen Michael had created. He knew how to separate truth from manipulation. In a meeting with the department's internal affairs team, Kofi ordered a full investigation into the suspicious activities. It became clear that Michael had not only been attempting to discredit Kofi, but had been involved in a larger effort to undermine the new leadership and the reforms that had been put in place. When the investigation revealed Michael's involvement in the conspiracy, the department was shaken to its core. The officers who had once stood beside Michael were now forced to confront the reality of his actions. Michael's behavior had not only been a betrayal of Kofi's leadership, but a betrayal of the very values he had sworn to uphold when he first joined the force. Kofi, however, handled the situation with the same grace and professionalism he had shown throughout his tenure. He made it clear that no one, regardless of rank or position, was above the law. Michael's downfall was swift, and the department had no choice but to terminate his employment. As Michael stood in front of his colleagues for the last time, he felt a profound sense of loss. The resistance he had clung to had led him down a path of self-destruction, and now all he had left was the fallout of his choices. The respect he had once commanded had vanished, replaced by the judgment of his peers and the undeniable truth of his actions. For Samuel Kofi, this moment wasn't about victory. It wasn't about punishing his adversary. It was about restoring integrity to the department, about reinforcing the values of fairness and accountability that had brought him into the role of chief. Kofi's leadership had been tested, and in the face of betrayal, he had remained resolute, showing that true leadership wasn't about wielding power. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity and doing what was right. As you watch this part of the story, consider this: what drives people to resist change, even when that change is meant to improve the world around them? And how can we learn to recognize when our own resistance is doing more harm than good, both to ourselves and to others? The video of Michael Anderson burning Samuel Kofi's passport went viral within hours. It wasn't just another isolated incident. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. People across the country watched in disbelief as the image of a law enforcement officer abusing his power and mocking a man for his nationality spread like wildfire. The video ignited a wave of public outrage, angry calls for just demands for accountability, and protests that filled the streets. It became more than just a story about one officer's behavior. It became a rallying cry for those who had long been fighting against racial injustice and police misconduct. In the aftermath of the video's release, Samuel Kofi found himself at the center of a storm. But unlike Michael, who had thrived in the shadows of power, Kofi's approach was open, honest, and unwavering. He addressed the public head on, not with defensiveness or anger, but with a quiet resolve. In a press conference that garnered national attention, Kofi spoke with clarity and transparency, making it clear that the incident would not be swept under the rug. What happened was not just wrong, it was a violation of everything this department stands for. But this is also an opportunity for us to show that we will not tolerate abuse and we will hold ourselves accountable. The department's values of fairness, justice, and respect will remain the guiding principles moving forward. I promise you this, there will be justice and we will reform the system from the inside out. His words resonated deeply with the public. Kofi's promise of reform wasn't just a political statement. It was a commitment that, through difficult but necessary actions, the department would rebuild the trust it had lost. The protests continued, but Kofi's transparency and leadership helped to quell the anger, replacing it with hope for change. His resolve to manage the crisis by focusing on justice and reform demonstrated the power of leadership rooted in integrity, even in the face of adversity. Meanwhile, Michael Anderson's world was collapsing around him. The consequences of his actions were swift and severe. The internal investigation into his behavior, combined with the public backlash, led to his immediate removal from the force. The department moved quickly to strip him of his badge, making it clear that no one, regardless of rank, was immune from the consequences of such blatant abuse of power. But the fallout didn't stop there. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Michael's behavior had been a pattern, not just one isolated incident. His colleagues, many of whom had once respected him, began to speak out. Former partners and fellow officers testified against him, detailing years of abusive conduct, discriminatory remarks, and a pattern of mistreatment toward those he deemed different. It wasn't just a matter of one bad decision. It was a career built on a foundation of prejudice and disregard for the very principles of justice he had sworn to uphold. The legal charges against Michael were extensive. He faced charges of misconduct, abuse of power, and racial discrimination. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and it became clear that his actions weren't just unethical, they were illegal. He had not only violated the trust of the people he was sworn to protect, but had also betrayed the very values of law enforcement itself. But perhaps the most painful consequence for Michael was the loss of his family's support. When his wife, Linda, and daughter, Emily, saw the viral video and the full extent of his actions, they couldn't bring themselves to stand by him any longer. The betrayal, the lies, and the cruelty he had shown were too much for them to forgive. Linda, who had once stood by him through thick and thin, felt that she no longer knew the man she had married. Emily, who had stood up to her father during their heated arguments, now realized that the man she had once admired for his career and strength had been someone she could no longer look up to. As Michael sat alone in his home, facing the consequences of his actions, the weight of his decisions began to sink in. He had lost his badge, his career, his reputation, and his family. What was left now was a broken man, forced to confront the consequences of his pride, his prejudice, and his resistance to change. For Samuel Kofi, however, the journey had only just begun. The protests, the viral video, the scrutiny, all of it pointed toward a brighter future for the department. But Kofi knew that true reform would take time. It would require continued dedication, not just from him, but from every officer under his command. The road ahead would be difficult, but Kofi was resolute. Change was not optional. It was necessary. And with the support of those who believed in his vision, he would rebuild the department from the ground up, ensuring that it was a place of justice, fairness, and respect for all. As you watch this unfold, consider, how can we hold people accountable for their actions in a way that promotes growth rather than perpetuating harm? And what role does leadership play in transforming a broken system into one that truly serves and protects everyone? Under Chief Samuel Kofi's leadership, the department began to rebuild brick by brick from the shattered foundation of distrust that had once plagued it. The public, still recovering from the shock of Michael Anderson's actions, needed to see that real change was happening, not just in words, but in concrete actions. And Kofi was committed to proving that the department could be a force for good, one that worked with the community, not against it. Kofi understood that the first step in restoring trust was engaging with the public in a meaningful way. He began by expanding the department's community outreach programs, going beyond the standard press conferences and town halls. He worked to create regular open forums where members of the community could meet with police officers, ask questions, voice their concerns, and suggest ways to improve policing in their neighborhoods. It was a deliberate effort to break down the walls of suspicion that had built up over the years. But it wasn't just about talking, it was about listening. Kofi knew that true change required understanding, empathy, and a willingness to learn from those who had been most affected by police misconduct. He encouraged officers to volunteer at local schools, mentor youth, and engage with community organizations. This wasn't just an initiative, it was a culture shift. The police force began to see themselves not as enforcers of the law, but as partners in creating safer, more supportive communities. Kofi also pushed for programs that allowed officers to live and work in the neighborhoods they served. It was an effort to humanize the police and to allow officers to see the world through the eyes of the people they were sworn to protect. As the program took off, it became clear that this shift in perspective was making a difference. Police officers, once viewed as outsiders, were now being welcomed into community events, becoming involved in local causes, and earning the trust of those they served. While Kofi's reforms began to take root, the shadow of Michael Anderson's actions still loomed large. For Michael, the fall from grace had been swift and brutal. He had lost his career, his badge, his reputation, and most painfully, the respect of his family. But in the quiet aftermath of his downfall, something shifted within him. Sitting alone, facing the wreckage of his choices, he realized that he couldn't continue living in denial. He had wronged not only Samuel Kofi, but the very community he had sworn to serve. Hitting rock bottom, Michael took a long, hard look at his life. He understood now that the anger, the prejudice, and the need for power had consumed him. He had thought of himself as above reproach, above the law, and above the very principles of justice he was supposed to uphold. But now, with nothing left, he had to reckon with the truth of his actions. It was in that moment that Michael made a choice to seek redemption. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and that his journey would be long, but he had to try. Michael reached out to Samuel Kofi, the man he had wronged in the most public and painful way. The conversation was awkward, uncomfortable, but Kofi listened, allowing Michael to voice the regret and remorse he had been holding inside. For the first time, Michael began to see the man he had once tried to tear down, not as an enemy, but as someone worthy of respect and admiration. Michael then turned his focus toward doing the hard work of rebuilding himself. He participated in community service, working alongside local organizations that supported marginalized communities. He helped mentor at-risk youth, offering his time to make a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. Michael also enrolled in professional ethics workshops, determined to learn from his past mistakes and to develop a deeper understanding of the moral responsibilities he had as a public servant. It wasn't easy. There were days when Michael wanted to give up, when the weight of his past seemed too heavy to bear, but he kept going, driven by the knowledge that true redemption isn't about avoiding consequences. It's about owning up to your mistakes and working tirelessly to make things right. As he continued on this path, Michael began to see the fruits of his labor. The people in the community who once viewed him with disdain began to see a different side of him, a side that was willing to listen, to learn, and to serve. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he hoped that his actions would demonstrate that he was no longer the man he had once been. Meanwhile, Kofi's reforms continued to reshape the department, creating a stronger bond between the police and the public. The changes were slow, but the momentum was undeniable. Officers were learning to approach their work with humility and empathy, understanding that their role was not to exert power, but to foster trust. In the end, Michael's path to redemption became a story of growth and transformation, not just for him, but for the entire department. Through his struggles, he learned that redemption is not a destination, but a process, a continuous effort to make amends, to grow, and to be better. As you reflect on Michael's journey, consider this. How can we as individuals and as communities create opportunities for redemption and growth? And how do we ensure that we hold ourselves accountable for our actions while also allowing space for change and healing? Samuel Kofi's leadership had not only transformed the department, but had also become a model for law enforcement agencies across the nation. His commitment to transparency, fairness, and accountability had created a ripple effect that was felt far beyond the walls of his precinct. The reforms he implemented, community engagement programs, anti-bias training, anonymous reporting systems, and internal audits, became a blueprint for departments everywhere, striving to rebuild public trust and create more just policing practices. Under his leadership, the officers in the department were held to a higher standard. They knew that their actions would be closely scrutinized, not just by the public, but by their fellow officers. This created a culture of accountability that permeated every level of the department. No longer were misconduct and abuse of power tolerated or ignored. The department had become a place where respect for human dignity was paramount, and where the officers themselves began to see their work as part of a larger mission to serve and protect, not just through force, but through integrity, compassion, and collaboration. The relationship between the police and the community continued to evolve. People who had once viewed officers with suspicion and fear began to see them as partners in creating safer, more supportive environments. The department's efforts to build bridges through consistent engagement, open dialogue, and volunteerism helped heal old wounds and foster trust. And as Samuel Kofi continued to lead, the department began to be seen as a symbol of hope, proof that true change, though difficult, was possible. Meanwhile, Michael Anderson's journey of redemption continued, albeit in a different form than he had ever imagined. He had not regained his badge, his career, or the respect he had once commanded, but what he found instead was something deeper: personal growth. Through his community service, his efforts to make amends, and the painful process of acknowledging his mistakes, Michael began to transform. He had once been driven by a need for power, recognition, and control, but now he was learning to lead with humility and empathy. His work with at-risk youth, his involvement in local organizations, and his commitment to self-reflection helped him grow in ways he had never expected. Though Michael would never regain the status he had once enjoyed, he found a different kind of fulfillment, a quiet sense of purpose that came from knowing he was doing something good, something meaningful. He had learned that redemption was not about regaining what was lost, but about understanding the impact of one's actions, taking responsibility, and working every day to become a better person. The man who had once mocked Samuel Kofi for his background, his passport, and his values had now become an advocate for fairness and justice. His work wasn't perfect, and there were days when the weight of his past felt unbearable, but Michael knew that every effort to help someone else, every act of service, was a step toward atonement. Over time, the department saw the changes in Michael too. Though he was no longer a police officer, his journey of self-discovery and reform didn't go unnoticed. He had earned the respect of those who had once been his peers, not because of his title or his past position, but because of the person he had become. His legacy, though not the one he had once envisioned, was one of growth, redemption, and a quiet, enduring commitment to make things right. For Samuel Kofi, his legacy was clear. He had left behind a department that was stronger, more just, and more connected to the people it served. His reforms were not just policies, they were a reflection of his core belief that law enforcement should be about protecting and serving, with fairness and integrity at its heart. He had turned a broken system into one that had a renewed sense of purpose and direction. As Samuel Kofi continued his work, the department flourished, and the example he set inspired others to take similar steps toward justice, not just in policing, but in every sector of society. His story wasn't just about what he achieved in his career, it was about the positive, lasting impact he had on others, proving that true leadership isn't just about making tough decisions, it's about making the right ones for the greater good. As you reflect on these legacies, ask yourself, what kind of legacy do we want to leave behind? How do we define success, and how can we use our own experiences to create lasting change in the world around us? As we come to the end of this story, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on some of the powerful themes that have unfolded: justice, redemption, and systemic change. These are not just abstract concepts, they are realities we face every day in our communities, our workplaces, and even within ourselves. At the heart of this narrative is the question of whether people can truly change after making significant mistakes. Michael Anderson's journey is one of profound transformation, showing that redemption isn't about erasing past wrongs, but about owning them, learning from them, and doing the hard work to rebuild trust. It's a reminder that growth is possible, even for those who have fallen the furthest. But it's also about systemic change, the kind of change that requires more than just individual effort. Samuel Kofi's leadership is an example of how institutions can evolve, how departments can rebuild their reputation and credibility through transparency, accountability, and community engagement. It's proof that real, lasting change is possible when we commit to doing the work, even when it's difficult. These are the kinds of discussions that shape our future. Can we truly change as individuals and as a society? How do we hold ourselves and others accountable while still making space for growth and transformation? It's a question worth exploring, and I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching and for supporting the channel. Your engagement helps keep these important conversations alive. If you found value in this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more content. Let's continue reflecting, learning, and growing together.